All right, so um, we will talk about theories of motion and physiology of emotion next time, but today we're going to talk about emotional expression. So when we talk about emotions, there are roughly 8 or so basic human emotions, and these are joy, acceptance, fear, surprise, sadness, disgust, anger, and anticipation. Now, depending on the researcher that you talk to, some people may argue that there are only 6 basic emotions, whereas some people may argue that there are more than 8. Generally speaking, researchers all agree that there are 6 basic emotions, and then some will add additional emotions like joy and acceptance or anticipation, those sorts of things. Um, this color wheel of emotion shows how these more complex emotions are related to these basic emotions. So the idea here is that we can take a basic emotion like fear and surprise and combine this in order to produce the more complex emotion of awe. In other words, or for another example, disgust and sadness is sort of combined to create our experience of remorse. The idea here is that this sort of wheel represents these 8 basic emotions. These different combinations can produce these more complex emotions. Also, inherent in this sort of organization, the colors that are opposite of each other tend to be opposite emotions. So these researchers would argue that optimism is the opposite of disappointment, joy is the opposite of sadness, anticipation is the opposite of surprise, these sorts of things. Now, I'll show you some pictures. When we talk about basic emotions, one of the things that we know about these basic emotions is they have particular facial expressions that are associated with them. So this is joy. This is the facial expression for anger, interest, disgust. Disgust is a very fun one, right? Think of something disgusting and you immediately make that sort of crinkly nose, kind of face. Surprise, eyebrows raised, eyes, wide eyes. Sadness, and then fear. Now, one of the interesting things about these facial expressions is as we go through and I show you these pictures, I'm sure most of you can recognize all of these emotions, right? If I just showed you the face and I said, tell me what this baby is thinking. You would be able to pull out the sadness, you'd be able to pull out the fear pretty quickly, right? And so there's a couple interesting things here. So one is that you're able to very easily and readily identify these facial expressions. But the other thing that's interesting is that these are babies. They're also readily and easily able to produce these facial expressions associated with these emotions. So in terms of emotional expression, there's a theory that some facial expressions, some human emotional facial expressions are universal. In other words, there are basic emotions that are universal to all people. And we know this because the theory argues that there are these universal facial expressions. So Darwin was one of the first people to suggest that there might be some universal expressions of emotions. He studied the relationship between emotions and their facial expressions, and he kind of argued that facial expressions of emotion were enhanced survival. And the idea was that if we were able to recognize the emotions in other people, right, we're better able to operate in our little tribe, our little group, and have all kinds of positive effects in terms of survival. And so he kind of argues that we have these sort of universal set of facial expressions that are part of our our shared evolutionary history. Now, Paul Ekman comes along a little bit later on down the line and does some studies trying to determine the degree to which facial expressions of these basic emotions are universal. And he started by looking at literate cultures. Specifically, he was looking at observers from around the world. These are, again, predominantly undergraduates from Western sort of industrialized cultures. And what he did was he showed them a series of photographs, and he had them label the expressions in the photographs. And he looked at students from the US, Argentina. He looked at several different students. And what he found was that there was a high agreement for facial expressions of fear, disgust, happiness, sadness, and surprise. All right, so Paul Ekman is one of the people who argue that these are sort of the 6 basic emotions: anger, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, and surprise. Now, when I say agreement, what I mean is that the people in the United States, when they looked at the picture of the person with sort of the furrowed brow and the sort of somewhat frowny face, they labeled that as anger. And the same people in Argentina, when they looked at that same picture, they labeled it as anger. Right? So this first piece of evidence suggests that there may be some universality to facial expressions of emotion, or at least these specific 6 basic emotions. And the idea here is that if there are universal facial expressions, then people from all around the world should be able to recognize these particular emotions as they are expressed. But one of the problems with this study is that all of these countries were literate and industrialized cultures, right? So they're all, they all come from cultures that have contact with other cultures. They all have sort of shared visual input in terms of access to media, access to other people in their cultures. Right, so it's difficult to make this sort of universality argument because it's difficult to rule out the alternative explanation that the reason why these people had such a high degree of agreement was because they all shared some basic aspects of culture. Right, so culture is a problem in this study. So Ekman, undeterred, decides to try and find a pre-literate culture. So they end up finding a tribe of people in New Guinea who are pre-literate, right? So they don't write, and they have very, very limited contact with the outside world. They're a very isolated group of people, right? And so in this way, they can sort of remove these effects of culture. They can control for these effects of culture because these people in New Guinea, right? They've never seen other people besides the people in their own little tribe. Right. So in this study, what they did was he told these Papua New Guinea people, these tribesmen, a series of stories. And each story was designed to evoke a particular emotional experience. A particular emotional experience in terms of fear, sadness, anger, disgust, these sorts of things. And then what he had them do is he told them a story, and then he had a series of photographs, and he asked them to select the facial expression that they would attach to that story. Right? So if one of the stories is, imagine that your son has just died. Right? This is a very sad experience. He would show them a series of pictures, and they would have to select the photograph. And what he found was, again, high agreement for anger, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, and surprise. Interestingly, the pictures that he showed them were actually pictures, the same pictures that he had used in study 1. Right? So these people were, these tribesmen were looking at pictures of people from cultures that they'd never seen before and had no contact with, and yet they were still able to correctly attach the facial expression of anger or sadness with the story that they were told about anger or sadness. And so again, this is building evidence, right? So we've ruled out the possibility that culture is what's driving this high agreement about these facial expressions. In study 3, what Ekman did is he had a separate group of these New Guinea tribesmen make facial expressions. So he says, show me what your face would look like if you were about to fight. So this is this first picture here on the left. This is sort of your typical anger face. This last one, show me what your face would look like if you met some friends. This is sort of the happiness or joy face. Okay. So he had them produce these facial expressions, and what he found was that not only were they able to produce facial expressions that were sort of consistent with the Western industrialized expressions of these emotions, but then when he asked Americans to label these expressions, he found again high agreement for anger, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, and surprise. Right? So these Papua New Guinea tribesmen were able to make these basic facial expressions, and then Americans who had no contact with them were able to identify or associate the correct facial expression with the correct emotion. So again, this is all evidence towards this idea that at least for these 6 basic emotions, there are these universal facial expressions attached to these emotions. Now, despite the fact that there are these universal facial expressions, there are definitely cultural rules or cultural prescriptions about when it's appropriate and when it's inappropriate to express emotions. So here's another study. It's the 4th study on universality. And what Paul Ekman did was he had American and Japanese students come into his lab, and he had them recorded while they were watching a stressful film. Now, by a stressful film, I mean a film that was designed to elicit the expression of disgust. And so you can only imagine how unpleasant that film would be, right? These are sort of very gruesome pictures. Let your imagination wander, very disgusting images. And so he recorded them while they were watching this stressful film. Now, what he found was, so he recorded these Japanese American students' facial expressions while they were watching this stressful film, or compared to control. And they were either by themselves, right, or they were describing their emotional reactions to a researcher, right? So he recorded them while they were watching it, and then afterwards he had them describe their emotional reactions either by themselves or to a researcher. And what he found was that when the American and Japanese students were alone, when they were by themselves, they elicited the same facial expressions, right? They both spontaneously elicited this showed this facial expression of disgust in response to this sort of disgust-provoking film or these images. But what was interesting was that in the presence of the researchers, right? So when the Japanese students were interacting with the researchers and they were talking about their emotional reactions to the researchers, their emotional expressions were much more muted. In other words, they were not as expressive when they were in the presence of the researcher, right? And what this suggests is that although there are these potentially universal facial expressions, these sort of 6 basic emotional experiences and exfacial expressions, there are culturally prescribed rules and standards of the appropriateness of expressing these emotions. So, for example, the theory behind why American and Japanese students might be different is because Japanese come from a collectivist culture where there is sort of it is less appropriate for you to display emotions. Right? Displays of emotions are sort of looked down upon. And so this is why they thought that the Japanese might change depending on the presence of the researcher. But again, it highlights this idea that there are these cultural prescriptions about when it is and when it isn't okay to express emotions. So we can all recognize emotions, and the ability to recognize emotional expressions might be universal, and to some degree, the expression of emotion is universal, but can be moderated by cultural prescriptions, right? But this form of expression is culturally determined, and we call these display rules, right? Positive emotions are a good example. There are certain situations where cultural display rules determine that you must display positive emotions, even if that is not what you are feeling inside. So here's a fun study called the unattractive present, or the unattractive gift paradigm. And what they did was they brought these young children into their lab, and they had them participate in a study. They asked them some questions, and at the end they gave them a gift, right? It was all wrapped, and it was meant to be a gift, and they said, "No, we did such a good job today. Here, let's give you the gift." And they give them the gift, And the gift is either a nice toy, right? A nice toy that would be something a kid would want, or the gift is like a dirty sock or a broken toy or a fork, like something just completely useless as a toy, something that no child would really want, right? And then what they did was they monitored their facial expressions, right, to see if they had learned the American display rules that suggest that if you get a gift you don't like, even if you don't like it, the appropriate way to respond is by smiling and thanking the person who gave it to you. Now, what they found was that 3-year-old girls, girls as young as 3, had already learned these culturally determined display rules that suggest that you must smile and say thank you even if you get a crappy gift, right? And so what this suggests is that these emotional expressions, even though we can all recognize and produce spontaneously these basic emotions, the extent to which we display them can be culturally determined, right? There are certain circumstances where it is inappropriate to display a negative emotion, like disappointment or sadness, like getting an unattractive gift. Incidentally, girls pick this up a little bit quicker than boys. So girls as young as 3 years old, will smile at the unattractive gift, but it takes boys until they're about 4 or 5 before they figure that out. All right, so that was briefly emotional expression. Now I'm going to go on and we're going to talk about a couple specific emotions. Namely, we're just going to go over fear and anger, and then we'll leave happiness until next time. So when we talk about fear, fear is this emotional response to a real or imagined threat, but it's a relatively adaptive emotional experience, right? So you can imagine in our evolutionary past, it's relatively adaptive for you to be afraid of snakes, right? If you don't know what snakes are poisonous and which snakes aren't poisonous, then having a healthy fear of snakes is actually relatively adaptive, right? Being able to learn what scares you is relatively adaptive. It helps you survive, right? So we can learn this through direct experience, right? So I can be walking down and then see a snake and have it sort of lunge out at me and learn fear of snakes through that. I can observe other people having an emotional response, right? So I might see someone else get bitten by a snake and die. Let's say it's sort of, several thousand years ago and I'm living in a tribe somewhere and I see one of my kinsmen get bitten by a snake and killed or get trampled by some large animal, right? I could learn to be afraid of those animals simply by observing other people. And it can also be conditioned or unconditioned. So recall we talked about this idea of classical conditioning, that if you take a stimuli and you associate it with a particular reflexive action, all right, you can condition that stimuli to that reflexive action, right? So if you're afraid of clowns, don't look at the screen, right? But these conditioned stimuli can be extreme, like phobias, like fear of clowns, fear of flying, fear of heights, these sorts of things. I'll put that away, sorry about that. These can be extreme. And essentially, these can be conditioned, right? So you can have a single experience of intense fear and attach that to the image of a clown from a very scary movie, and then that can generalize to just a general fear of clowns. So we can learn fear through a lot of different ways. But generally speaking, fear is an adaptive emotion because it helps us to survive. Now we talked about emotion. We talked about the amygdala as being part of the limbic system that's involved in processing emotion. Thus far, we've talked about how the amygdala, how emotional experiences are important to us, and the amygdala can actually sort of emotion, or the amygdala can sort of turn up memory processes, helping us to remember events that are that have emotional content to them. And we know that the amygdala is strongly activated when we're experiencing emotions, especially fear. It's involved in all emotions, but it's definitely involved in fear. So if we take and we implant electrical probes, similar to what you did for last week's homework, we take and we implant electrical probes into the brains of rats, and we stimulate that amygdala, in particular clusters of neurons within the amygdala. We can get rats to elicit fear response. So they behave as if you've just put a cat or some kind of very strongly eliciting fear response, so a strong eliciting fear stimuli in their crate with them, right? Simply by stimulating the amygdala, right? So stimulation of the amygdala elicits emotional responses, fear responses in the absence of sort of naturally fear-producing stimuli. And likewise, if you lesion the amygdala, so we selectively destroy groups of neurons, we can actually disrupt natural fear responses, right? So a rat that has had a portion of their amygdala destroyed will just wander right up to a cat, right? Which is not adaptive, and also is sort of counterintuitive. Rats sort of are relatively hardwired to be fearful of predators like cats. And so we know that the amygdala is heavily involved in emotion from studies such as this. Now, there are two ways that we can process fear stimuli. There are two ways. There is sort of the low road and the high road of fear stimuli, and it has to do with the degree of threat or the degree of fear, is for lack of a better term, the degree to which we are afraid of something. So when we process something on the low road, right, we're thinking about Texas Chainsaw Massacre Man, right? This is when we are confronted with some kind of fear-producing stimulus, right? And this runs through the thalamus, right? So again, the thalamus is sort of this sensory hub, like all sensory input and output goes through the thalamus, right? And our brain sort of recognizes this as an immediate threat to our safety, right? This causes us to experience fear through the amygdala, and then this very quickly activates some physiological response, either running away, slamming the door, right? Some kind of very, very quick response, right? So the low road is designed for these very intense fear experiences, and it's designed to allow us to respond as quickly as possible, with as little thought as possible, right? So you can imagine if you were sort of getting off of the L and it's late at night, and someone jumps out in front of you from an alley with a weapon of some kind, right? This is going to immediately trigger this amygdala sort of low road fear response, right? And the idea here is that minimal processing so we can speed up reaction time, right? So your kung fu skills jump into action and you bat the knife out of their hand and run away really quickly, right? This is sort of the idea of the low road. Now, the alternative is sort of the high road of fear processing. Now, the high road is reserved for sort of less intense fear stimuli. So the idea is, let's say you see Gary Busey walking down the street. Gary Busey is sort of, if you don't know, he's an actor. He's sort of a chronically unstable person. Maybe he's in a good mood today and he's going to be pleasant. Maybe he's, in a bad mood and he's going to completely freak out. You just don't know. And this activates this sort of high road of fear processing. And the high road is sort of the natural road. This is what happens when we're not really sure we're kind of afraid, but we're not really sure how much of a threat or situation we're in. All right, so the fear stimuli comes in, it runs through the thalamus, and whatever the stimulation is, it isn't enough for the thalamus to send it directly to the amygdala. And so this information gets processed along the normal route, right? So it goes back into our occipital lobe, it makes its way up through towards the prefrontal cortex, and then back down to the amygdala for this sort of fear response, right? If necessary, right? Maybe Gary Busey's in a great mood, and you decide, you know what, I don't need to run, because if I run, he's just going to chase me, so I'm just going to keep on walking right by. But perhaps you decide that he is in a really bad mood, and then you need to run. But the idea here is that there are these two ways in which we can process fear stimuli. This is sort of the low road, which is the quick response to intense fear-related stimuli, and then there's the high road, which is the relatively slow response that allows more time for thinking and planning and cognition, right? This isn't the Chainsaw Massacre Man, ready to cut you in half with a chainsaw. This is Gary Busey, and you're not really sure whether or not you should run away from him or not. So we'll talk briefly about anger, and then we'll call it good for this online lecture. So anger, it's emotional state. This can range from sort of mild irritation to an intense rage. It's associated with physiological changes, so increased heart rate and blood pressure, increased adrenaline. People generally get angry with their friends and loved ones, especially if whatever they did was willful, unjustified, and avoidable, right? And these are pretty critical to determining our level of anger, right? If someone does something on purpose, that's willful. If they have no reason for doing it, unjustified, and they could have done something different, we're going to be the most angry with them. But if it's not willful, right? They didn't have any control. They didn't do it on purpose. Or if there's some kind of justification, there was nothing else they could have done, right? We're going to be less angry about whatever it is our friend did that made us upset, right? So these three factors, degree of control, degree of justification, and degree of plausible alternatives, really impact our level of anger, right? We're going to be the most angry. So let's say your significant other was supposed to pick you up from somewhere, and they didn't show up. And when you talked to them, they said, "Well, I'm sorry I couldn't make it. I knew I had to pick you up, but I was in the middle of this game, and I didn't want to pause it, so I just kept playing, and I figured you'd be okay." Right? In that situation, right, that's willful. There's no real good justification, and it's potentially avoidable, right? Compared to, well, I was on my way to pick you up, and for lack of because this just happened to me today, right? I was on my way to pick you up, and my dog got hit by a car, and the dog was injured, and I had to take him to the hospital, to the vet hospital, and there was nothing else that I could have done, right? Not necessarily willful, not necessarily avoidable, but somewhat justified, right? Potentially, depending on how you feel about dogs, I suppose. Interestingly, we don't just get angry with people, we also get angry about other things in our environment, right? So we don't like foul odors, we don't like high temperatures, we don't like being physically uncomfortable, we don't like traffic jams, right? So all of these things can produce an experience of anger. Now, there is a hypothesis called the catharsis hypothesis that suggests that if we vent our anger, it reduces our anger. And usually catharsis implies some kind of physiological activity. So when we talk about venting, we're not talking about telling your friend about the situation, but we're talking about physically, punching a wall or punching a pillow or something like this. It seems like it's calming, right? It seems like, if you've ever engaged in this kind of behavior, it feels as if you are sort of calming down. But in the long run, the catharsis does not work. So telling someone a story about something that made you upset is just going to function to keep you in that state of anger. Punching a pillow keeps you in that state of anger. Generally speaking, when people are given opportunities to express their anger, they're more likely to express higher hostility after they've expressed it. And part of the problem here is that one aspect of anger is this sort of increased physiological arousal, and one way to reduce anger is to reduce physiological arousal. And this is difficult to do if you are rehearsing the anger by telling someone a story about it, or if you are physically trying to express the anger by punching something or hitting something, that sort of thing. Generally speaking, forgiveness has more positive effects on your body than expressing a grudge. There's a whole host of literature that suggests that people who hold grudges are more likely to have negative health outcomes like high blood pressure, heart problems, these sorts of things, compared to people who are chronic forgivers. So there's a whole host of positive effects for sort of letting go of anger. And again, part of this has to do with sort of reducing that physiological arousal. So things to do to reduce anger: relax, try and reduce your physiological arousal. Just stop talking about it. Go read a book. Go do something else. Go for a walk. Try and not think about it. Try to reduce your level of physiological arousal. Also, cognitive restructuring, right? So changing the way that you think about these things, which we'll talk about, I believe, either at the end of this week or next week. And part of this is sort of avoid thinking in absolute terms, right? So if you're having a fight with your significant other, right, and you say, well, you never put the toilet seat down, and that makes me really angry. It's probably not true that they never put the toilet seat down. Maybe they don't do it maybe they don't do it as often as you'd like, right? But if you think in these absolute terms, that's going to help you to maintain a state of anger. Problem solving can help to reduce anger, right? So if you are stuck in a traffic jam and it's making you angry, perhaps you can find an alternative route. Likewise, if you're having a fight with your significant other about something, working towards some kind of common solution as opposed to thinking in terms of absolutes, some kind of compromise can be helped to reduce anger. And then last, rumination, right? Don't constantly think about what makes you angry, and put yourself back into that state of anger. Work to let it go. Work to forgive. So that's pretty much it for anger. We'll leave it there. Like I said, take a look at this between now and the next class, and we will have some more discussion about this the next time that we meet.